preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sharon Goldman. I am the program director for the Brofman Center for Jewish Life here at the 92nd Street Y. And on behalf of the 92nd Street Y, I welcome you to this evening's program, part of our series, The Masters, Great American Filmmakers. Before I introduce Jeremy Dauber, who by now I think everybody knows, I just want to take a moment to personally invite you to a few of our upcoming events, help you navigate through the so many programs we have here at the Y. First of all, on Friday, March 9th, if you haven't attended yet, we have a new series called the Shabbat Salons. What it is, on Friday evenings, about once a month, we invite different artists, musicians, not filmmakers, but movies, etc., or even filmmakers, to present different talks, lectures, really light and sweet, followed by a wine and dessert reception. So doing a little kiddush, celebrating Shabbat, but in a very cultural kind of way. And we invite you to, again, on Friday, March 9th, to one called Let My People Go, a Jewish and African-American celebration of freedom. It's a Jewish gospel singer who's also a rabbi, with African-American gospel singers. So it should be a fantastic evening, and I really encourage you to check it out. On another side of the spectrum, on Monday, March 12th, we have a program called Young Muslim Leaders, Their Voices, Their Visions, and Their Hope. And we invited a whole group of Muslim leaders in their 20s and 30s who are currently living in the United States, working with the Jewish community to not just the Jewish community, but all communities, but specifically the Jewish community, to really try to speak about peace. And we're going to be meeting with them. There's a panel discussion, and again, a very fascinating evening that should not be missed. And to kind of round it out, on Tuesday, March 13th, we have Rabbi Ron Wolfson here, speaking about how to do God's work on earth. And that should be quite inspirational. So to learn more about those events and other events, please feel free, if you don't have one yet, to pick up a catalog on your way out, or of course, visit 92y.org. Or you can ask me after the event. Now to introduce Jeremy. Jeremy Dauber is the Associate Professor of Yiddish Literature at Columbia University, and he is truly one of the 92nd Street Y's dearest friends. He has lectured here many, many times, and he is over and over again, one of our most popular lecturers, and we're so pleased to have him here for this series, The Masters, Great American Filmmakers. We're pleased to have him here again for the last one in this series on May 3rd, Sydney Lumet. Don't forget to buy your tickets now, because as you see, we sell out almost every one of his programs. Without further ado, so we can begin our program, please join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to Professor Jeremy Dauber. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you all very much for coming today. I want to take the next bit of time to speak a little bit about Steven Spielberg, the man who Life magazine has called the most influential figure of the 20th century. Didn't make this up. And Premiere Magazine certainly calling the most influential filmmaker in the entire history of the movies. And talk about him a little bit, not just as the filmmaker that everybody knows him as, but particularly in the context of being a Jewish American filmmaker and a great Jewish American cultural figure. So as a result, this is not going to be exactly the same talk that you would get more generally if one were to speak about Steven Spielberg, but it'll have a specific slant on it. And I'm going to do that by giving you a little bit of his biography, and then we're going to talk about some of his movies, perhaps some of the expected movies and some of the less expected movies, I hope, as well. And then I'm going to leave time for questions, and I'm going to try and do all of this by 8:45 so that you can all go home. So to start off from the very beginning, Spielberg was born in 1946, at the end of 1946 in Cincinnati, to Arnold and Leah Spielberg. The family name comes from the Austro-Hungarian Duchy of Spielberg, where apparently Spielberg's ancestors were in the 17th century. So already you have your first fun fact to use at home. And Spielberg's maternal grandfather, who he knew growing up, was an Orthodox Jew who was a Russian immigrant, and whose name, although he is known now as Philip Posner, he was known as Philip Posner, was better known to his family as Fievel, which is where, for those of you who watched the Spielberg-produced movie, The American Tale, Fievel Mouskowitz, who comes to America, is based on, very, very loosely on Spielberg's grandfather. For one thing, Spielberg's grandfather was not a mouse. Just in case you were not sure. And Spielberg, from a very early age, as a result, knew about traditional Judaism. He claims that his first memory, when he was 6 months old, was being taken to a synagogue and seeing, as he describes it, the light that came out from behind the doors to the Ark of the Covenant. And that this light, which is often called by critics and by him the God light, as we'll see, comes up again and again in his work. It's this sort of this sense of there's something great, there's something mysterious that is beyond sort of the capacity, certainly of a 6-month-old, to imagine. As you'll also see, Spielberg often tends to tell stories about his background, some of which I think are probably true. He grew up with Fievel telling him stories about what it was like in Russia. He grew up, as I say, around Orthodoxy, but in areas which were not conventionally Jewish communities. His father, Arnold Spielberg, was an electrical engineer and as a result moved the family around a lot. And Spielberg has a very clear memory of being the only family on his block who did not have Christmas lights up. And this was something that was very problematic for him, because he was at a very early age already feeling like he didn't quite belong. He didn't quite fit in. And this was to be a theme of wanting to fit in and feeling like you don't. That is, I think, one of the most important themes to understanding Spielberg's Judaism and how that Judaism becomes refracted into his filmmaking work more generally. Spielberg's family was, as they described it themselves, storefront kosher. That is to say, they observed Jewish religion when the rabbi or Leah, his mother's parents, were around. But other than that, they weren't particularly. But also from an early age, Spielberg was well aware of the Holocaust. As I say, he was born in 1946. His father's family lost many relatives in the Holocaust, and he learned, at least, he has a very early memory of learning the difference between the numbers 6 and 9 by a relative or a family friend, he's not sure, who had the numbers on his arm and sort of turned his arm over to show that a 6 could be a 9. So from a very early age, he had this consciousness around him. Obviously, though, the most important factor in Spielberg's growing up was not his Judaism, but was movies. He went to see his first movie at the age of 6. It was The Greatest Show on Earth, and his father told him that they were going to see the movie, and he somehow thought that it was an actual circus that he was going to see. And so he came into the theater, according to him, and he just sees this big white screen, up there, and he's wondering, he's 6 years old, where are the clowns? Are they behind the screen or something? And then when he realized that they were actually on the screen, he was, of course, tremendously disappointed. But he then went on to realize that this was something that was filmed, and he connected that with his father's habit of bringing a movie camera along on their camping trips and filming what they were doing. Spielberg was a child who did not have a lot of control in his life. As I say, he was picked up and moved a number of times in his very early childhood. And I think that he seized on the movie camera, taking it from his father and then filming the camping trips and then directing his family, you stand here and you go there and all this, as a means of trying to gain some sort of control over a family life that was beginning to become increasingly out of his ability to influence. And as time went on, I think that became even more pronounced. That is to say that as his adolescence went on and his family began to have great difficulties, eventually culminating in his parents' divorce in the mid-'60s, that he retreated more and more into filmmaking as a source of power. And this power, I think, was even more important given that Spielberg was having great difficulties in school. And at least some of those difficulties stem from an amount of anti-Semitic activity that he claims affected him, particularly in the last areas that his family moved to in Phoenix, Arizona, and then specifically, or I should say especially, Saratoga High School in California, where, according to him, there were people who beat him up every day after school, that threw pennies on the ground for him to pick up, who would yell Jew at him, all of these things. And that he describes his senior year of high school as really being literally the worst experience of his life in hell on earth, and he said this in the 90s, that he has never, in fact, forgiven them for making him feel like he stood out, like he didn't belong, and that he connected that very specifically to his Jewishness. But one of the ways that he was able, at least in some form, only in some form, to help alleviate some of those problems was to create these very large amateur filmed productions where he could bring people in. And he has this story where one of the people he brings in is this bully of his. That is someone who was an anti-Semitic bully who used to, torment him and beat him up. And instead of just ignoring him, he decides to co-opt him and cast him in his film. And then he gets to order him around, right? Because he's the director. So this is a kind of method that I think, again, is predictive for Spielberg. If you can't beat them because you're alone, you're small, you're an alien, you're a minority, then you can co-opt them. You can have a kind of control over them in that sort of way. And so I think that Spielberg's love of the movies, his genuine love of the movies, also has some of these factors psychologically in back of them. Spielberg, as I say, finishes up high school in California after his parents' divorce. And all of this turmoil in his life did not make his grades any better, and he was at best a C student. And so when he applied to the top filmmaking programs, even though he had done all of these extremely advanced amateur films, he was rejected by both UCLA and USC's School of Cinema and Television on 3 separate occasions. I think it's fair to say they have lived to regret that. And as a result, he did something. He went to California State University at Long Beach, and during that period of time, he began to get involved with the Universal, with the lot at Universal. Now, the way Spielberg tells the story, Universal then, as it does now, had a whole series of tours, that you could take, get on a trolley and kind of ride around the back lot and see them making pictures and all that. And what he did was he got on, dressed in a business suit and a briefcase. He snuck off the trolley. He went into the big building, found an empty office, and just sat down and started making phone calls. And he did this for about 5 or 6 months until he came to someone's attention. The truth is a little less glamorous than that, but still it is one of these great Hollywood stories, which is to say he made a short film called Amblin, which he wanted to sort of have for theatrical release. Someone at Universal saw it, and they became very interested in it. Amblin is no longer available, to the best of my knowledge, for commercial showing, but it's an interesting story, and the story is about, basically, it's a 24-minute short film, and it's about this hippie boy and this hippie girl who kind of ramble, which is where the word Amblin comes from in Spielberg's imagination. And they ramble around California, just living the hippie lifestyle. Remember, this is filmed in the late 60s. And the man has a guitar case that he will not let out of his sight. And at the end of the film, the girl finally gets to peek into what is in the guitar case. And it is, in fact, a business suit and wingtips and a science fiction novel. And I think that it doesn't take a great psychological genius to figure out what Spielberg is dealing with here. That is to say, he is a college student in the late 60s, and he's very interested in this sort of countercultural revolution, but he has the heart of ultimately a conventional filmmaker in him, of not a countercultural individual. And he has mixed feelings about that. And I think that this is one of the things that will continue to affect him and certainly affect critics' views of him for a long time. All of Spielberg's amateur pictures, the ones that he made before he went to college, are genre pictures. They have titles like Fighter Squadron and The Road to Nowhere and The Great Train Wreck. These are not the works of an avant-garde filmmaker. And at the same time, though, he is of the same generation of the group of people in the late 60s and the 70s who really are trying to remake film in a kind of avant-garde way. People like Francis Ford Coppola and John Milius, and obviously to a lesser extent George Lucas, who it's hard to remember now, but started out kind of as a more avant-garde filmmaker. At any rate, Spielberg did not go in that direction. As I said, he was on the Universal lot, hanging around, trying to make contacts, make phone calls. He wasn't trying to burn down the building. He was trying to work from within. And so it's not so surprising that he gets his start in television in the early 70s, which at the time, maybe less so now, but certainly at the time was considered an extremely workman-like place, a journeyman's place to start your job as a director. They don't want anything fancy, right? The schedules of television production didn't allow for anything like that. You just had to come in and come out. And Spielberg, his first work on the strength of Amblin, is to direct an episode of the Twilight Zone-esque television show Night Gallery, starring Joan Crawford, who apparently took one look at the 21 or 22-year-old director, and those of you who have seen pictures of Spielberg from an early period know that he looks much younger than he actually is. So he probably looked about 15 and almost, walked off the set, basically. But Spielberg charmed her and won her over and began to do some television directing, and on the strength of that, continued to do more things. Until finally, he got within television what was then considered a glamour job, which is to do a TV movie of the week, which I think in the mid-70s was more exciting than it sounds now. Maybe. At any rate, he directed the movie Duel, which was only briefly released here theatrically. And for those of you who don't know, this is a movie which I think you could best describe as Jaws, with Jaws being played by a truck. Okay, so, there's this guy, there's this big, faceless, malevolent truck, and he chases him all over, and then, bad things happen, and then ultimately, because it's Steven Spielberg, good things happen, right? So, but it became a real director's success, and on the strength of that, he was able to pick his next project, and that project ended up being Jaws. That next project ended up being a small movie called The Sugarland Express, which tanked, it's fair to say. It was a deeply thoughtful, heartfelt, kind of countercultural movie about people on the run and people who weren't understood, and society was out to get them, and it did terribly at the box office, and that was it for Spielberg. And so then he got the chance to do Jaws, and essentially speaking, he didn't look back. My favorite story about Jaws is that they had a very early screening of the finished product of the film. And they were showing the film, and this man was watching the movie, stands up, runs out of the theater, goes to the lobby, vomits in the lobby, and then comes back and sits down. And Spielberg says, "That's when I knew I had a hit." Right? And quite a hit it was. I mean, in these days of $300 million grosses and billion-dollar worldwide grosses, it's hard to think that a movie that breaks $100 million is a big deal. But of course, at the time, it was a huge deal. And Spielberg, at that point, really could do no wrong. And so he decided to make a very personal movie that had been haunting him for years, ever since his father had taken him to see a meteor shower in the skies over Arizona. And he was stuck with the feeling that there must be something greater that is out there. And as a result, he turned to making a movie which was first, and I'll talk more about this a little bit later in the lecture, first called Kingdom Come, but eventually was referred to as, of course, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Nobody thought this was going to be a big hit, and everybody was wrong, of course. William Goldman's first rule of Hollywood is that nobody knows anything. And we could make a little asterisk here and say maybe except Steven Spielberg, because he has had, ever since Jaws, a tremendous grasp on the popular imagination. I'm not going to talk about all of his other movies in detail. I'm just going to focus a couple of years later. He and George Lucas, who at that point I think were responsible for 4 of the top 10 grossing movies in American history, basically worked together to create Raiders of the Lost Ark. And the reason I bring that up now is not only because the Ark itself functions, largely speaking, as a MacGuffin within the movie, as sort of a side thing. It's not that important in its own right, but also that it marks Spielberg's first use of the Nazis, but does so in a way that is not particularly meaningful. Right, as one of the critics at the time said, it uses it for simply a thrill of evil, for graphic and even comic possibilities. Right, there's nothing really such a big deal about the usage of Nazis there. A year later, Spielberg decides to make his most personal film, a film which he considers to be about his own family as they're going through a divorce, where he, as a lonely little boy, said, "Wouldn't it be great to have a friend who you could always count on? And wouldn't it be great if that friend was just as misunderstood as I am, and so just as alone as I am? And wouldn't it be great if that friend were 900 years old from outer space and came down in a big spaceship with lots of lights on it?" And the result was E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which, again, I mean, this is a refrain, obviously, an enormous hit, and gives Spielberg even more clout, if such a thing were possible, enough to provide him the opportunity to make a personal or a quasi-personal story about the suffering of minorities in this country. He has at this point been nominated for a number of his films for Best Director. A number of his films have been nominated for Best Picture. He's not won at Oscars. And so he turns to making The Color Purple. And in 1985, he's approached by Quincy Jones, who says that he thinks that Spielberg would be a great person to make The Color Purple. And Spielberg says, "Well, I mean, this may be a bit of a problem because I'm not black." And Quincy Jones apparently said, "Well, you made E.T. and you weren't a Martian." So I guess that argument worked, and he made it. And, it got some warm critical reviews. And it was around that time, I'm going to skip ahead, but it was around that time when Spielberg first heard of a book that had come out, which was based on the story originally, or was told the story by one man named Poldek Pfefferberg, who was one of 1,100 Jews who had been saved by Oskar Schindler. And basically, this is probably something that most people here don't know. Pfefferberg had been trying to pitch this story for a long time to Hollywood. There had actually been a version of the story going around in the 1960s with Sean Connery slated to play Oskar Schindler, and that fell apart. And then Thomas Keneally, who was he was coming back from a plane trip to promote another novel, and he was extremely overheated in the sun, and he had to go into a store, a luggage store, where he found Poldek Pfefferberg, who was the owner of the store. And Pfefferberg said, as apparently he had said to any writer who had walked into his store in the last 20 years, "You're a writer. I have a story for you." And he told the story, and Keneally said, "Well, I am not the person who should write this story because I was only 3 years old when the Holocaust ended, right? I'm not Jewish, and I don't know that much about Jewish suffering. I'm a Catholic." And he said, "Well, those are precisely the reasons that you should tell the story, because this is a story that the world needs to hear." And so Keneally comes out with the book Schindler's List. The book makes its way to Spielberg's desk. And Spielberg, I think, from a very early period, realizes that this is a story that would be important for him to tell, but is extremely nervous about the possibility of telling it, and particularly about him telling it, because he's already begun to internalize the rap that critics have been giving him for decades. He's not a serious filmmaker. Everything he does turns into a blockbuster. Everything is about popular entertainment, right? And he says in an interview in 1989, and this is a direct quote, he says, "A feature film about the Holocaust is going to be studied through a microscope, and it's going to be scrutinized from the Talmud to Ted Koppel. And it has to be accurate, and it has to be fair, and it cannot in the least come across as entertainment." Right? This is Spielberg's concern, and in fact, he tries to push the project off to Scorsese for briefly, and also to Roman Polanski, who would, of course, later make his own Holocaust-related film. But things have begun to happen in Spielberg's personal life as well. In the late 80s, He had married and then subsequently divorced Amy Irving, and then married Kate Capshaw, who had converted to Judaism in order to marry him, in order to become his second wife. And he similarly, right before that, had a son, his first child, with Amy Irving. And both of these things, apparently, seem to have made him consider much more the value and the importance of his own Jewish identity. And as a result, he begins to say that this is a story that he himself needs to tell. He says that he felt a strong pull to go back to traditions, and that for a long time he was ashamed, this is a quote of his, he was ashamed of being a Jew, and now, for the first time, he is feeling pride. And as a result, Schindler's List becomes more than a project that is just, as he said for the first time he heard it, a hell of a story, and becomes an actual film that he feels that he needs to make. And he does so. He goes to, as everyone knows, he goes to Krakow. He films on location. He films with a tremendous number of extras from the country. He has some extremely disturbing experiences, as did the crew. Ralph Fiennes, who, as everyone knows, made a tremendous impression as the Nazi Amon Goeth, was standing around one day, still, waiting for the next shot in his Nazi uniform, and an old Polish woman who apparently was under the misimpression that he was actually who he was pretending to be, came up and said, because there were all these Nazis around, said, "I'm so glad you're back. I hope that you finish the job that you started 40 years ago." So this was something that I think convinced all of the cast and Spielberg that this was a film that they really needed to make. And it explains, I think, perhaps Spielberg's fury when an executive said to him, "Look, why don't you just take the money you were going to use to make Schindler's List," one executive said this, "and donate it to a Holocaust museum, because nobody is going to watch this, nobody cares about this, nobody's going to pay any attention." And Spielberg's point, of course, was that the attention must be paid. The movie, of course, became an enormous critical and commercial success. Spielberg donated all of his proceeds to a series of foundations that he set up, one of which was to capture the testimony first of the Schindler Juden, the Schindler Jews, and then as many other Holocaust survivors as possible on film, combining these obsessions, perhaps, or interests of his. And then, of course, generally speaking, and we'll return to this a little bit, but generally speaking, the critical reception was rapturous. The only exceptions were some particularly, although not solely, Jewish critics who had felt that, first, the Jews are extras in the film in their own tragedy. The main character, of course, is a non-Jew. That this is ultimately an optimistic message, right? That is to say, this is a message of 1,100 survivors rather than it is this. Of all of the people who have died. And I think also that, and I'll get back to this even the most, that many of the same kinds of ways that Spielberg talks about the movies in general, he applies to some of the most monstrous characters, particularly Goeth, that he humanizes him in certain ways, that he makes him understandable or explicable. And this is something that we'll get back to. At any rate, after Schindler's List, and I should point out that same year that he made that, 1993, he also released Jurassic Park, which, and here's another fun fact, was, at least as of the late 90s, responsible for the most money that any single individual has made on any single movie. He made $250 million from Jurassic Park. Just so you can know. What's this about anyway, if you don't know things, right? And he then begins to, I think, really shuttle back and forth between what we could call entertainment movies and serious movies, right? There's Saving Private Ryan, and then there's Minority Report, there's The Terminal, and then there's Munich, right? And really going back and forth from these sort of things. In this last year, he was the recipient of a Kennedy Center honor, and as many of you know who are fans of movies, you probably saw him on Sunday night watching the Oscars, where he was nominated as producer for Letters from Iwo Jima, which is, I believe, his 12th Oscar nomination. And of those, six of those nominations come from Best Director, and 7 of the movies that he directed were up for Best Picture. So a really remarkable record. And that's all I want to say about his biography. And I'll take questions later, but for now, I want to focus more on what we can think about the movies, which have become part of our essential imagination. I think that it's fair to say that anyone who has been watching movies for 30, 35 years can't not think of some of the great moments of Spielberg. And most of those great moments, I think it's also fair to say, come from movies that are not conventionally considered his Jewish movies. And I guess the question that we can ask is, how is it that we can use and we can think about the movies that Spielberg is perhaps most famous for, and Spielberg's general filmmaking over, to talk a little bit about the nature of his Jewish identity? Well, I've already begun to suggest that by saying that Spielberg's own biography is in some ways one of the representative of one of the great stories of American Judaism. Not all of them, but one of them, which is to say this desire to fit in, this acceptance that there is the possibility of fitting in, of doing so by creating culture that is going to appeal to everybody as much as possible. And in doing so, to hope, right, that by one's own, let's say, acculturation, by the sublimation of one's own Jewishness, that you can, in fact, be loved by everybody. Spielberg has always said that he makes movies for the audience as a whole, right, the largest possible audience. And I think that I want to start by looking at two clips, one from the end of one of his most famous movies, one from the next one from the beginning of another of his better-known movies. You can play the first two clips. Okay, so the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, right, and the beginning of Saving Private Ryan, as you saw. And I think that first, you know, this ending, although I'm sure it was not explicitly or consciously designed this way, of taking this particularly Jewish object, this Ark of the Covenant, locking it into a big U.S. Army box and putting it in with all these other American boxes, right, is something which is in some sense symbolic of kind of what Spielberg, certainly at the beginning of his career, wanted to do, right? To say this is this Jewish particularity, that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the idea that in all these boxes, right, the covers all look the same. There are all these stories that can be told, and they're all American stories. And if you're trying to have Spielberg put himself out as an American filmmaker, you can't do more than look at the patriotic circumstances that surround Saving Private Ryan. I mean, the man begins with a shot of an American flag just rustling in the breeze, right, and holds on it, as you can see, for quite a long time. Given these things, it's not surprising to find that one of Spielberg is a great art collector and has one of the most important private collections of a particular American artist. Does anyone know who? Anybody? Jasper John? He may have Jasper John, I'm not saying, but his biggest collection is of Norman Rockwell paintings. He is the biggest private owner of Norman Rockwell, and he was very important in in funding the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge. So I think, I mean, again, how much more American can you get? The man collects Norman Rockwell paintings, right? But at the same time, there is this issue of a kind of Judaism that is hidden. Spielberg insisted on rewriting the Robert Redford-esque character in Jaws and in the first script of Close Encounters of the Third Kind to cast Richard Dreyfuss, who is both an everyman, but a particularly Jewish kind of everyman in those roles. And so I think that there is a kind of Jewishness that is certainly, even from his earlier, most popular films, in there and coming through. And in that vein, I want to talk first about some of the ways in which that kind of sensibility, which I'm going to argue comes from his Jewish background, is present in these early films. And the first is what I'll call a kind of religious imagination. If Spielberg at the beginning of his career is not a particularly or particularistically Jewish filmmaker, he is certainly a religious filmmaker. But he's a religious filmmaker for a secular age, right? He knows that people have this desire for something greater than themselves, and he gives that to us masked, not in the form of traditional religious encounters, but with encounters with some higher, literally, powers that themselves are wondrous. And it is easiest, I think it's fair to say, for him, both because of his own sensibilities and because of the power of belief and where the way belief works, to cast those as encounters between children and those powers. And so let's play the next couple of clips, please. That's the God light, by the way.
All you can get is those 40-year-olds.
How do you win this game anyway? Huh?
There's no winning. It's like life. You don't win at life.
Money helps.
Yeah, but...
All right. Where's the pizza?
Mom, there's some out there. It's in the tool shed. It threw the ball at me.
Maybe it was an iguana.
It was no iguana.
Maybe you know how they say there are alligators in the sewers?
Alligators in the sewers.
All we're trying to say is maybe you just probably imagined it.
I couldn't have imagined it. You can't tell. Not even Mom. Why not? Because grown-ups can't see them. Only little kids can see them. Give me a break.
She's cute, right? True, right? People forgot. I think that, first, again, there's that God light, as I had mentioned, that first thing that Spielberg claims that he saw. But we have this insistence, this encounter, right, with something which is beyond, and this insistence that it is not any of the traditional rationalistic explanations, right? It's not an iguana, it's not an imagination, it is real. And of course, that's what it turns out to be. And the children are very easily able to incorporate that into their belief system. But that the movie itself E.T. becomes about accepting this. And it's not surprising that a number of people described from a very early period watching E.T. as a religious experience. One of the producers of the movie, and one has to excuse normal producers' hyperbole, but he says on the first screening of E.T., "I don't think there's ever been an experience like it. It was truly a religious experience. It must be a little bit like the way people feel if they've seen God." Again, you have to excuse producers. But and a number of critics have argued that E.T. itself is particularly a Christian parable, right? He comes back from the dead. He raises the flowers come back to life. There's a kind of Lazarus effect here. And this is what Spielberg says about this. He says, "The only time that the writer and I sort of looked at each other and said, boy, are we getting into a possibly sticky area here, is when E.T. was revealed to the boys on the bicycles, and he's wearing a white hospital robe, right, like this, and his immaculate heart is glowing. We looked at each other at that point and said, well, this might trigger some speculation. We already knew that his coming back to life was a form of resurrection. But I'm a nice Jewish boy from Phoenix, Arizona. If I ever went to my mother and said, Mom, I've made this movie that's a Christian parable, what do you think she'd say? She has a kosher restaurant on Pico and Doheny in Los Angeles. So, Spielberg himself is not necessarily thinking about these in Christian terms, or refuses to accept that they're in Christian terms, but is trying to think of them in more of a universal, bleached out religious encounter terms. But it's easy, as I said, for little kids to believe. And Spielberg, who has always considered himself a kind of arrested child, in the best possible way, I think, identifies with that. But he's very aware that those kind of muscles of wonder become much harder to accept when you're an adult. And as a result, I think in one of his other early movies, he has a wonderful a wonderful depiction of what it might mean to really engage with the difficulties of encounter with something that is beyond one's understanding. Can we play the next clip, please? We're going to do two different adults here. This is the first.
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant, the chest the Hebrews used to carry around the Ten Commandments.
What do you mean commandments? You're talking about the Ten Commandments?
Yes, the actual Ten Commandments, the original stone tablets that Moses brought down out of Mount Horeb and smashed, if you believe in that sort of thing. You guys ever go to Sunday school?
Well,
well, look. The Hebrews took the broken pieces and put them in the Ark. And when they settled in Canaan, they put the Ark in a place called the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, where it stayed for many years. Until all of a sudden, whoosh, is gone.
Where?
Well, nobody knows where or when.
However, an Egyptian pharaoh...
Shishak.
Yes, invaded the city of Jerusalem around about 980 BC, and he may have taken the Ark back to the city of Tanis and hidden it in a secret chamber called the Well of Souls.
Secret chamber.
However, about a year after the pharaoh had returned to Egypt, the city of Tanis was consumed by the desert in a sandstorm which lasted a whole year. Wiped clean by the wrath of God.
What are you trying to do? Scare me? You sound like my mother. We've known each other for a long time. I don't believe in magic, a lot of superstitious hocus pocus. I'm going after a find of incredible historical significance. You're talking about the boogeyman.
You and I are very much alike. Archaeology is our religion. Yet we have both fallen from the pure faith. Our methods have not differed as much as you pretend. I am a shadowy reflection of you. It will take only a nudge to make you like me, to push you out of the light.
Now you're getting nasty.
Okay, so, I mean, I think with Indiana Jones, obviously you don't want to take Raiders of the Lost Ark too seriously because in some ways Spielberg himself doesn't. In other words, here is an individual who, on the one hand, insists very much on the power of his skepticism. He doesn't believe in an Ark of the Covenant. He doesn't believe in this, all of this stuff, this boogeyman stuff, and that archaeology is his true religion, right? That he only thinks of these things as objects. They have no real religious power. The fact at the end of the movie, and everyone I'm sure remembers this scene, the fact that something proves him wrong, right? The fact that they open up the Ark of the Covenant and all these spirits come out and, the people's faces melt and all that, that doesn't actually change Indiana Jones one bit, because Indiana Jones is fundamentally a two-dimensional character, and the movie is, and I mean this in the best possible way, it's a phenomenal movie, two-dimensional, right? The Ark goes back into the box, they all go back there, Indiana Jones lives again to have two sequels that nobody, he doesn't have to think twice about it. Compare this, on the other hand, to a more realistic movie in which Spielberg's everyman character, not a character like Indiana Jones, but an everyman character, has to deal with a revelation of something that is beyond his comprehension. Play the next one.
Oh, shit.
The Air Force is conducting secret tests in the foothills area.
It would be easy to say yes to that. But I'm not going to mislead you. This is not the case. To tell you the truth, I don't know what you saw.
You can't fool us by agreeing with us.
No, come on, no. I saw Bigfoot once.
So, unlike Indiana Jones, right, who is really able to deal with, the opening of the Ark of the Covenant is just another day in his sort of line of work, Richard Dreyfuss is living in the quote-unquote real world, and he needs to deal with the fact that there has been nothing less than a revelation, right? And that the world is actually a much more complicated place, right? They say, look, we would like to be able to give you a perfectly rational explanation, right? But we're not going to give that to you. But at the same time, they're not giving it to them, right? Is just as much of a rejection as, simply saying, yes, we understand you. And in order to show this further, I want to show a couple more clips and then discuss the archetype, discuss the figure that I think Spielberg is trying to talk about here. So if we can just show the next couple of clips, and I'm going to say a little more about Dreyfuss. This is after the encounter.
Well, I guess you've noticed something that's a little strange with Dad. It's okay, though. I'm still Dad. I can't describe it. What I'm feeling. And what I'm thinking. This means something. This is important. That's not right.
This is, if you recall, he's forced to make these things. He doesn't... He just starts making them.
That's not right.
What is it? What is it?
You ever look at something when it's crazy and then you look at it in another way and it's not crazy at
No,
all?
I haven't, no.
So, what do we call somebody who all of a sudden has a kind of encounter with something divine, or something beyond that, perhaps I should say, who, as a result of that, is disbelieved by everybody, who ruins their family life, who doesn't know, right? It fundamentally changes their personality. They don't know what it is that they have this message within them, but they know that there's some kind of message. And they're just hoping for the answer to prove that if you look at it just in the right way, that everything makes sense, that they're not crazy at all. Well, we call that person a prophet, right? That's what prophets did. That's what prophets are. And it's Spielberg's brilliance, working originally again from this first script by Paul Schrader, but then substantially rewriting it, to cast this into the contemporary setting and to say, well, what would it be like to receive a message from a higher power now? What would it be like? And the remarkable thing about Close Encounters of the Third Kind is that in the last part of the movie, we are given in no uncertain terms the answer that, in fact, the prophet is right. Right? You remember with all of the big lights and this, and not only is it a higher power, right? Not only is there the answer that there actually is some existence, right? But that higher power both is capable of communicating with us. You remember this bum, 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 right? And also that it is good. It comes in peace. It means no harm. And I want you to think back again to the movies that Spielberg was watching of aliens from the 1950s. The original title of Close Encounters of the Third Kind was Watch the Skies, which, for those of you who are real film buffs, you might recognize, is the final line of another science fiction movie involving aliens, a movie called The Thing from Another World. And from the title, you can tell that thing, not so friendly, right? Compare that to Spielberg's Close Encounters, where not only do they mean no harm, do they come in peace, but they even bring Richard Dreyfuss back up on the mothership to come up to heaven, just like Elijah at the end of his story, right? The grand prophets get to go up to heaven alive. That's what their reward. And as Pauline Kael, who I think is always quite interesting and often brilliantly right, her line apparently was, God is up there in a crystal chandelier spaceship and he likes us, right? So this is what happens, I think, here. And it was interesting that Spielberg had originally thought about using at the very end, and think about this from your memories of the movie, to end with the song When You Wish Upon a Star playing as they went up. And he decided against it because that would have reminded everyone that it was firmly in the realm of fantasy, right? That this was a live action version of a Disney movie. And that is not the point that he wanted to get across. He wanted to get across this idea that in fact this was in its own way reality, in the same way that many Jews, many religious people think of an encounter with a higher power as real, or certainly as something to be yearned for. Right? And that this, in some sense, provides a universal sentiment and sensibility of this without actually getting into details. Okay. Him coming up to heaven alive, as I say, is also about him going home, right? Once he's been touched by this, he doesn't really belong with his family. He really belongs with this other group. And again, as I've said before, Spielberg's alienation, Spielberg's own personal biography, makes him feel particularly like there is some home out there that he wants to be part of, but that he's not really there by virtue of his own biography, by virtue of his interests, by virtue of his geekiness, by virtue of his Jewishness. And so I think you will not be surprised to hear where we're going with this.
E.T. home phone.
E.T. phone home. E.T. phone home. E.T. phone home. He wants to call somebody.
What's all this shit?
E.T. phone home.
My God, he's talking.
E.T. phone home.
E.T. phone home.
We could be happy here. I could take care of you. I wouldn't let anybody hurt you. We could grow up together, E.T.
Where should we go?
Don't go east, that's for sure. They hate you there. I wouldn't go west either, if I were you.
Eventually, the Arab states will rise against Israel. They don't like Palestinians, but they hate the Jews more. It won't be like 1967. The rest of the world will see by then what the Israelis do to us. They won't help when Egypt and Syria attack. Even Jordan. Israel will cease to exist. What?
This is a dream. You can't take back a country you never had.
You sound like a Jew.
Fuck you. I'm the voice inside your head telling you what you already know. You people have nothing to bargain with. You'll never get the land back. You'll all die old men in refugee camps waiting for Palestine.
We have a lot of children. They'll have children, so we can wait forever. And if we need to, we can make the whole planet unsafe for Jews.
You kill Jews, and the world feels bad for them and thinks you're animals.
Yes. But then the world will see how they've made us into animals. They'll start to ask questions about the conditions in our cages.
You are Arabs.
There are lots of places for Arabs.
You're a Jew sympathizer. All you Germans, you're too soft on Israel. Well, you give us money, but you feel guilty about Hitler. And the Jews exploit that guilt. My father didn't gas any Jews.
Tell me something, Ali.
What?
Do you really miss your father's olive trees? Do you honestly think you have to get back all that nothing? That chalky soil and stone huts? Is that what you really want for your children?
It absolutely is. It will take 100 years, but we'll win. How long did it take the Jews to get their own country? How long did it take the Germans to make Germany?
And look how well that worked out.
You don't know what it is not to have a home. That's why you European Reds don't get it. You say it's nothing, but you have a home to come back to. ETA, ANC, IRA, we all pretend we care about your international revolution, but we don't care. We want to be nations. Home is everything.
So I think you can see in this sort of provocative juxtaposition how Spielberg's desire, right, in E.T. to talk about the importance of home first can be seen as a parable in some sense of the failures of a kind of acculturation, right? That even when there is someone like Elliot who cares for and loves E.T. and wants to make a home for him here, right? One's home is one's home. And you have to go back to that. This then leads to the question, right, which is raised at the end of Schindler's List, where the third clip is from, of where is the home for the Jews? And that this powerful statement, which is almost made conversely by the argument with the Palestinian, who the Palestinian is saying, is that home is important. Everybody needs a home. And you can see how Spielberg's general universal feelings about this have both been extended to the Israeli context, and also for Spielberg in that clip, at least, to articulate the Palestinian point of view in terms of their desire for a home, that feeling which for Spielberg is natural for everybody. Now, I want to play, before I say anything more, that this next clip where it's the only time you're actually going to see Steven Spielberg.
You should make no mistake that I am not attacking Israel with this film. In no way, shape, or form am I doing that. This is a very, very tough subject, and we've decided to approach it honestly and unsparingly. This film is an attempt to look at policies Israel shares with the rest of the world and to understand why a country feels its best defense against a certain kind of counter-violence. And we try to understand this as filmmakers through empathy, because that's what you do. You extend empathy in every single direction because you can't understand the human motivation without empathy.
Now, I'll get back to the counter-violence things in a little bit, but I want to focus right now on that last point that he makes, that he says, look, we're making a movie. We have to understand this as filmmakers. And when you do that, when you tell stories, you tell them by trying to get inside, by empathetically trying to get inside the heads of the characters and trying to import one's own feelings and sensibilities, right, into them as one tries to understand them, because that's naturally what you do. And again, this is an interest of Spielberg's, this empathetic approach, this trying to understand what people feel, that goes back a long way. Let's look at an earlier film in this regard, with one of the most empathetic characters.
Damn it, why don't you grow up? Think how other people feel for a change.
To Elliot. Right? This was a scene included by Spielberg.
As we get started with the dissection, remember that the things that you are writing down.
And Spielberg was interested in making E.T. so empathetic that he actually develops a bond.
One thing that you should
with
be
Elliot.
looking for during the dissection is to locate the heart and notice that it is still beating. Okay, to once more emphasize the similarities of those things which we see in the similarities of human anatomy.
The Arabs and the Israelis are perfectly compatible as far as I can tell. And now, as you say, Peter, you're quite right. They've been jolted apart again, as they were seeming to come just a little closer, a little hope.
We've just gotten the final word. You know, when I was a kid, my father used to say, our greatest hopes and our worst fears are seldom realized. Our worst fears have been realized tonight. They've now said that there were 11 hostages. 2 were killed in their rooms yesterday morning. 9 were killed at the airport tonight. They're all gone.
So, again, you notice first that the ET, where you have this sort of empathetic treatment where they are so symbiotically linked, and then this idea that's expressed in a clip here where he says, well, I can't see how the Arabs and Jews aren't perfectly compatible with each other, right? Except and then what happens after that. Now, if there's anything that the first part of this lecture should have said, it is certainly that Spielberg has no time for people who are anti-Semitic. His own background, I think, makes that very clear. But it is the case that he is interested, when he tells a story, in trying to understand both sides of the story. That is to say, to understand a kind of empathy with them as a filmmaker. And I think that the test case for this is not Munich, because Munich is a very hard situation to deal with, but is a movie in which we can see where he is testing the limits of empathy. And that movie is Schindler's List. And this raises the question, are there any kinds of limits to this? So let's look at that.
People die. It's a fact of life. He wants to kill everybody? Great. What am I supposed to do about it? Bring everybody over? Is that what you think? Send them over to Schindler. Send them all. His place is a haven, didn't you know? It's not a factory. It's not an enterprise of any kind. It's a haven for rabbis and orphans and people with no skills whatsoever. You think I don't know what you're doing? You're so quiet all the time. I know. Are you losing money? No, I'm not losing money. That's not the point. That's not the point. It's dangerous. It's dangerous to me. You have to understand, Gert is under enormous pressure. You have to think of it in his situation. He's got this whole place to run. He's responsible for everything that goes on here. All these people. He's got a lot of things to worry about. And he's got the war, which brings out the worst in people. Never the good, always the bad. Always the bad. But in normal circumstances, he wouldn't be like this. He'd be all right. There'd just be the good aspects of him, which is a wonderful crook. A man who loves good food, good wine, the ladies, making money, killing. He can't enjoy it. He won't shoot you because he enjoys you too much. He enjoys you so much, he won't even let you wear the star. He doesn't want anyone else to know it's a Jew he's enjoying. He shot the woman from the steps because she meant nothing to him.
So listen to the lesson, right? This is Goethe, right? The worst of the worst. And it is important, I should point out, that in Kienele's book, Schindler apparently detested Goethe from the beginning. But this is not the case, as you can see in these clips, right? Because Spielberg finds it necessary to create a kind of empathetic identification. We have to understand, at least for a moment, where he's coming from, right? This is Schindler's false understanding in some ways, but we have to understand some kind of way into that character. And even with the woman, Helen Hirsch, where he says, look, it's different, right? It's a different thing because for you, he really has a connection with you. And so as a result, he's not going to kill you. And in fact, in the movie, this is what happens, right? Her life is saved because, within the movie, of the emotional bond that Goethe has managed to make with her. And this actually leads to one of the great questions about Schindler's List, and indeed about Schindler, which is what Spielberg called, in filmic terms, the rosebud moment. What is it that made Schindler decide to do this? Why did he do this at all? Kinnelly, who is, as I said before, a Catholic, has this idea that there's some higher power that makes him do it. But that's not a reason for Spielberg, at least in filmic terms. And as a result, it leads to, I think, an explanation of one of the most powerful and puzzling moments in the movie, if you don't mind.
Sign here, initial there. Makes no difference to us, you understand? This one, that one. It's the inconvenience to the list.
Right, so first, nothing, it's just the list. This is a moment where, which is based on the novel, not the novel, the account, where Schindler was watching the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto. And he saw, in the midst of all of this horror, all of this terror, he was looking down.
Oh, please, let's go. Let's go.
And Schindler,
Come on.
1 second, let's see it in a minute. Schindler sees a girl, a beautiful little girl in a red dress, who is wandering through the moment as if she doesn't see anything at all. And this was apparently a moment that Schindler remembered for the rest of his life. And Spielberg sort of has commemorated this moment by an almost entirely black and white film, as you remember having this one bit of color. And later on, although I'm not going to show this in the lecture, you see her dead, actually. You see that red color again. And the question is, why did he do that? And I think that if we look at what we've been saying about empathy, that moment of color standing out from the black and white makes sense. For Spielberg, it's the precise moment that he's able to focus not on just one more, one less, it makes no difference to the list, but the moment of an individual, right, who stands out from everything else. And he can focus on these people, on an individual as an individual, and that achieves a kind of empathy that turns him around. Again, it's a very subtle thing. It's not done in any explicit way, but I think that is what Spielberg needed for himself and for the viewers to be able to say, to turn Schindler from a businessman into someone who is a savior. Now, all of this violence, I think, gets to the final set of points that I want to make, which are about Spielberg as a creator of violence. Certainly Schindler's List and a lot of this anti-Semitism stuff in Munich, as we'll return to, is about the dangers of violence. But Spielberg is himself a very violent filmmaker, as we know.
These are toys. These are little men. This is Greedo. And then this is Hammerhead. See, this is Walrus Man. And then this is Snaggletooth. And this is Lando Calrissian. See? And this is Boba Fett. And look, they can even have wars. Look at this. And look, fish. The fish eat the fish food, and the shark eats the fish. But nobody eats a shark.
The world has been rough with you, with your tribe. It's right to respond roughly to such treatment.
That old Pesach story. Angels are rejoicing because the Egyptians have just drowned in the Red Sea.
I didn't say we're rejoicing. I said we're celebrating.
And God said to the angels, why are you celebrating? I've just killed a multitude of my children.
Mr. Zawito, he cost us, by my calculations, roughly $352,000.
You didn't finish the story. The angels respond to God. They say, God, we're celebrating Because when the people hear what happened to the Egyptians, they'll understand your point.
Which was? Don't fuck with the Jews.
So we have on the one hand this thing that Eliot begins to say, right, this cycle of violence, things eat other things, right, and then there's somebody who ends up being on top, right? There is violence, but there's someone who is going to be, by virtue in some sense of being the hero, who is the person who can just shoot the guy, right, and get it over with. He's the big action hero, right? And there's a way in which we want, as consumers of Spielberg's conventional films, to have this kind of violent answer. But that is Spielberg as action filmmaker. And the question that Spielberg is beginning to deal with increasingly as a result of his movies about war and certainly his movies about Jewishness, that whether or not that is a sufficient or possible solution. And Munich is, I think, dedicated to the message that, as we'll see in these next clips, that he doesn't feel that way at all, let's say, in the real world.
Said Muchasi is in Athens in 2 weeks.
Not one of our names.
Nevertheless, he's Black September's KGB contact.
Hussein Al-Shir was the KGB contact.
Yes, but you put a bomb under Monsieur Al-Shir's bed in Cyprus, and now he's defunct. Muchasi is his replacement. I hear he's much tougher than his predecessor.
In 7 months, we've killed 6 of the 11 names. We've killed 1 replacement. One of our targets is in prison, and 4, including Ali Hassan Salame, are at large. One of our own has fallen. Since we began, the other side has sent letter bombs to 11 embassies, hijacked 3 planes, killed 130 passengers in Athens, and wounded scores more, and killed our military attaché in Washington.
Some of it was done by a Venezuelan called Carlos the Jackal, who replaced Zaid Muchasi, replaced Hussein Al-Shir. Black September's original leadership has been decimated. But new leaders are emerging for whom Black September wasn't violent enough.
There's no peace at the end of this, no matter what you believe. You know this is true.
Here's what I know. Your father is sick. Your mother will be alone. You're a Sabra. Your wife and daughter are Sabras. What I came to say is this. Come home.
And that scene is one of the final scenes in Munich, right, which ends, I think, quite controversially with the shot of the Twin Towers, perhaps in Spielberg suggesting that there is this cycle of violence, again, continues on with even more catastrophic consequences. It seems then that for Spielberg, at least at this point, I think he's not only reflecting on this in some ways as, let's say, a student or an observer of the political situation, but also in terms of a filmmaker, right? Once we ask for kind of sensations, once we have a bang in an action movie, we can't go back, right? The next movie has to have a bigger bang, and the one after that has to have a bigger bang after that. And you can never stop making things more and more violent. I mean, if you compare, for example, the amount of action in Jaws, which was a tremendously violent movie for its day, and the amount of action in any blockbuster now, you'll be amazed. Jaws is positively sedate by comparison. So the question then becomes for Spielberg, I think, as someone who is against violence, right, who is against this discrimination, this hatred, this anger. These are not particularly bold positions to take, but where does one go from that? Right? What is his answer to things? And I think that Spielberg's optimism that we've seen earlier plays itself out in the most straightforward and yet the most important fashion. This is from Schindler's List.
The list is an absolute good. The list is life. All around its margins lies the gulf. It's Hebrew from the
Talmud. It says whoever saves one life saves the world entire. What's a person worth?
No, 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 no. What's one worth to you?
So Spielberg is, as an optimist, right, he's very much on the side of life, right, of this being, of saying there are other people, people are war, people are fighting, people are trying to do these things, right, but for us, for him as a filmmaker, for him as an optimist, for him as a Jew, right, all of, and he quotes, you see there's a quotation from the Talmud there, all of this is about saving lives. And I think that's the result that for the war story that he decides to tell, the World War II story, right, which he decides to try and make an extremely problematic story, is answering that question that is asked in Schindler's List, which is, what is one life worth? And that movie, I'm actually going to skip this clip, if we can skip down, but this clip is from Saving Private Ryan, which is very much dedicated to the question of how much is one individual's life worth? If you recall, there's one private who they send this whole mission out. A lot of people get killed. And the question is whether or not this guy is worth it. And in fact, Tom Hanks sort of says at the end of the movie to Matt Damon's character, to Private Ryan, he says, earn this, earn what we have done, earn all that we have sacrificed to you. But despite the importance of this, it seems, I think, very much for Spielberg that this is a difficult solution to come to, because first of all, it's not very interesting, I guess one could say. It's important to save lives, fine, right? But also that the filmmaker's job, in some ways, is to talk about particularities and not abstractions, right? Even, as we said, Munich is the story of this particular small instance of these characters, right? As opposed to trying to deal in a much more broad way with everything that's going on. And so as a result, I guess the question is, how does Spielberg's optimism, his idealism, all of this sort of transcendent idea, this idea of stuff that is beyond, reflect into his Jewish identity? And I want to point one final clip from Munich and then try and tie everything together.
All this blood comes back to us.
Eventually it will work. Even if it takes years, we'll beat them.
We're Jews, Avner. Jews don't do wrong because our enemies do wrong.
We can't afford to be that decent anymore.
I don't know that we ever were that decent. Suffering thousands of years of hatred doesn't make you decent. But we're supposed to be righteous. That's a beautiful thing. That's Jewish. That's what I knew. That's what I was taught. And now I'm losing it. I lose that. That's everything. That's my soul.
And with that, I think that we can see a lot of Spielberg's messages come together. That is to say, that for Spielberg, the fundamental optimist, Jewishness is so deeply rooted within him and so important precisely because in his reading of it, it is optimistic. It is supposed to be thinking about being better than the world. And if we feel that that is unrealistic, well, look at who we're talking about. Look at Steven Spielberg. Steven Spielberg is not a man who makes realistic movies. He is someone who opens up in our imaginations the possibilities of transcendence, the possibilities of there being something greater. He opens up the idea that there is this kind of mythical home that we all aspire to, that we can't actually find, right? But that we hope is somewhere there. He has an idea that life is an ultimate good, right? And that he tells the stories of the most horrible things and focuses on the life within it, and the idea that when one saves a single life, that is the biggest victory of them all. In a scene that I couldn't show, Liam Neeson's character Schindler says, "I could have saved more. I could have saved more." And basically, the Schindler Juden let him off the hook. Now, I am not going to throw stones, of course. How can one? But it is fair to say that this is the only way Spielberg could have told the story, right? That a single life is an optimistic victory, because that is what Jews do. Jews are on the side of life. Jews are on the side of optimism. Jews are on the side of finding something which is the best and the greatest about the imagination. Even if they don't live in the world as well as they do in their minds, they live in their minds and in their dreams. And for Spielberg, that is the highest possible praise that you can give a group. And as a result, I think that even though for many years Spielberg was not someone who addressed his Jewish identity explicitly, all of his movies, as I've tried to show, all of his greatest, his most powerful movies are about the ideas and the ideals that he accorded with Judaism all along. It only took movies like Schindler's List in Munich, which enabled him to say it. So with that, I'll thank you all very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.